Deakin says, the only person who can be Prime Minister is Edmund Barton. All the people know it. All the politicians know it. Get your act together.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. If you ask the average Australian who was our first Prime Minister, many, let's be honest, probably most would struggle to answer. Was it Alfred Deakin? Robert Menzies? Billy Hughes? They might be names that spring to mind, names of a bygone era. But Edmund Barton was a crucial figure in our move to federation and our first Prime Minister. Joining me today for Afternoon Light is someone who is trying to change the lack of knowledge of the figure Edmund Barton amongst our general population. Dr. David Headon is a Canberra-based historian and is currently overseeing a fascinating project, the First 8 project, to bring to light the stories of our nation's earliest, our first 8 political leaders to public discussion. Welcome to Afternoon Light, David.
Very nice to be on the program, Georgina.
David, Edmund Barton, we know him, I think, in grade 6 history. The kids around Australia learn a bit about federation. So if people can remember, once they've left school and gone on to their general lives, they might remember a little bit about Edmund Barton. But really, we don't talk much about our founding fathers in Australia. I've always wondered if it's tall poppy syndrome or we just want to get on with things. We're very practical people. We're not like the Americans and want to sort of have grandiose origin stories. And of course, our origin story for modern Australia is not one of civil war, of strife. It is one of incremental evolution. But Edmund Barton is a fascinating figure. He's an important figure. And perhaps his story is sort of quintessentially Australian too. So tell me about who he was.
Okay. I mean, a really significant figure. And it is the case, those individuals who are as old as me would remember the advertisement campaign for the Centenary of Federation, Georgina, back in 2001. In fact, when I was Centenary of Canberra advisor in 2012-13, I was on the ABC doing some state line programs for TV, and they managed to find the original advertisement that ran all the way back in 2001 when the young boy comes into his father who's reading the paper, the sport pages of the paper, and says to him, you know, who was our first Prime Minister? And he sort of is aghast and says, go ask your mum. And she comes back and tells him, you know, it was Edmund Barton, Dad. And it was really popular at the time. And, of course, the bit that sort of followed that was what nation wouldn't know the name of its first Prime Minister. And I suspect since that's sort of 25 almost years ago that's been lost as well, so that we've even lost that sort of, you know, the collateral element in 2001. But Barton was very important, as all of our early Prime Ministers were, Georgina. There were such stories. One of the delights of this project that I've been doing for a few years now is to sort of find the personal stories behind the big story. And there are, you know, to go back to your intro there, it is the case that for a whole range of reasons we've lost contact. You know, Robert Menzies said in 1944 when he did a sort of intro for the first decent biography on Barton, which was by John Reynolds, Henry Reynolds, the historian's father, who was then a teacher in Tasmania. And that came out in 1948. And Menzies did the intro, wrote it in late 47 and said, you know, we've lost contact with our predecessors. Even then, you know, we're talking the late 1940s. So there is it's almost generational as well. And for this generation, I think it's hardest of all for younger people because of phones, everything that's going on with social media. We don't have to go into that. But it's made it, you know, that distancing, that gap is even more so the problem. But Barton has a great story. It's a story of the first 7 Prime Ministers, importantly, and that's not known by many, they all were members of the very first Parliament. And in the case of Deakin, Alfred Deakin, Victorian boy, Melbourne boy, and Barton, New South Wales, Sydney boy, both were, as the phrase used at the time, was native born. So the other 5 Prime Ministers in that first group of 7 were all born overseas. And that's interesting and significant. Now, Barton's story begins, he was born in 1849, and those who know their history back then would know that was the anti-transportation sort of era, and in fact almost a high point. His parents, his 19-year-old mum and his 32-year-old father married in Britain in 1827 and came straight out here. His dad was odd, you'd have to say, was quite odd. Loved his religious poetry, wrote religious poetry, and was seen to be Australia's first stockbroker. Interesting claim, but he was erratic financially, to say the least. Mum was not. Mary Wider was definitely not. She was educated, she was smart, she was the rock of the family. She was also bred rather well. There were 12 children. Edmund was number 11 of 12. And in that group, those people who perhaps know Australian literature might know the earliest books, but Edmund Barton's older brother, 12 years older than he, who went to the Middle Temple, went to the English bar because he's very, very bright, came back here and produced 2 books in 1866, The Literature of New South Wales and Poets and Prose Writers of New South Wales. So he became a kind of interesting cultural figure, and we might touch on that later. But in Edmund's case, born in 1849, had a background that mirrors Deakin in Melbourne. That is to say, for Deakin, Melbourne grammar, for Barton, Sydney grammar. Growing up, in Barton's case, around the Rocks area, went to Fort Street Primary School and then Sydney grammar, and then did law, just as Deakin did at the University of Melbourne, did law at Sydney. But he loved the classics. In fact, he had 2 magnificent teachers. He had a man called William Stevens at Sydney Grammar, Oxonian, who was ultimately offered the chair of natural history at Sydney University after grammar, but Barton had him. And then he went to Sydney University and had the man Charles Baddam, the so-called Baddam of Wadham, who was seen to be, by the Greek experts, the most significant Greek historian in the world. And he had him. So Barton used to carry around, cop this for size, he had his Thucydides in his pocket, he had his Herodotus histories, he had his Virgil Aeneid, used to write in, I've seen them at the National Library here. He also used to practice his signature. You know the old habit when you were about 10? But Barton had that habit of practicing, thinking he might be famous. Well, he certainly would be that. Anyway, he was outstanding with the classics. He got all sorts of prizes, both at school and then when he went to university. So that was his background. Then he did law. But he was also a sportsman, Georgina, or we might get onto that.
It's interesting. I mean, a couple of questions there, David. Fort Street Primary School comes up a bit, doesn't it? I mean, significant Sydney figures seem to have gone to this school. What is it about this school? Is it just because there weren't very many schools in inner city Sydney?
There weren't going back. There definitely were not. And it was one of the significant ones. On one more recently, for Michael Kirby, is a Fort Street boy. As it turned out, my older brother, I said that went to Fort Street. My brother-in-law went to Sydney Grammar. So I've got these various connections that come to the fore, mostly through sport. But it was one of those schools. It's always been seen as a very fine school. It, and probably throw in North Sydney Boys High. I know that sounds odd, but it was one of those that produced all sorts of sports people, do you know what I mean, significant parliamentarians. So a very significant school, but that's true for sort of grammar as well. It was the era, Georgina, then, Barton growing up, of so-called muscular Christianity. You know, play up and play the game. You know, Waterloo was won, didn't the Duke of Wellington say on the Waterloo was won on the fields of Eton. And there was that sort of feel in the private school, private and public schools of Australia, but that certainly included grammar. So that was Barton's background, was this era of muscular Christianity and this era of the native-born quote beginning to emerge out of the sort of convict stain. And Barton is lucky enough to be a part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, that was actually quite an important feature of Barton's personality and his background. Was his parents were born, of course, in Britain, but he was born and raised in Australia, so absolutely a believer in, well, firstly, of course, the colony of New South Wales, but in the sort of Australian project, the Federation project, and this sort of, I guess, nascent Australian nationalism that you see developing through the late 19th century and, of course, well into the 20th century. He's such a protagonist in that. I wonder around his interest in the classics. I mean, did that, and obviously he was a brilliant student. I mean, he was Dux of Sydney Grammar. He won the University Senate Special Prize, won prestigious scholarships at the university in his second and third years, graduated first class honours in classics, and, really was an exceptional student. But was his interest in classics and in sort of carrying around copies of Thucydides and Herodotus's histories, was that seen as a little quirky, or was that something you would expect a high-achieving student of that era?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because if we compared it to Deakin, I said that they had similarities, very strong similarities, except Deakin was a nerd. Deakin wasn't interested in sport whatsoever. Barton was the exact opposite. In an era of sporting consciousness coming to the fore, so let's just plant the year 1870s. Well, it's certainly the 1870s. That is the era when the, quote, native-born actually begin to outnumber those who've come by ship. So it's the critical decade. And it's also a formative decade for Barton. So here he is at Sydney University. He is bright as a button, to say the least, but he's also really interested in sport. He was a reasonable cricketer. He did, in fact, look down the 22 yards of the cricket pitch at the fastest bowler in the world, Fred the Demon Spofford. So Spofford's the man who in 1877 wins the first Ashes test in Melbourne and then goes to England where, with a Victorian bowler called Harry Boyle, they demolish an English 11 in the second so-called Ashes test. They absolutely go through them. So you've got that happening around. Now, in Barton's case, he's so interested in that. This is a fellow, we have his 1869 diary, Georgina, in the National Library. So there he is. He's about, say, what is he, about 20-odd. He's already got a fishing mate down at the harbour, a fellow called George Reid, who would go on to be our fourth Prime Minister, who's 4 years older. He's gone into the public service and doing all sorts of really interesting things. Barton's at university. They both love fishing. They go out and about. They go to the government balls. Reid was not native born. He was born in Scotland, but he may as well have been because he really embraced that spirit, really, the sort of zeitgeist of the 1870s. So you've got Barton, who's a sportsman. He's a delegate to the Southern Union, the first rugby union in Australia. He's on the board of the New South Wales Cricket Association when he's 23, very prestigious indeed. He's a cricket umpire. He's already umpiring when he's 24, the New South Wales Victorian interstate games, which are massive. So he's got that happening. So there is plenty going on. But most of all, to get to it, you're asking what happens, and I think kind of the idea, well, where did politics start to emerge? Well, first of all, you've got a Sydney University where there's about 23 voters, almost literally, where they've got a seat in the assembly, and there's like 30 or 40 people who vote for it. But he's at Sydney University, he's not even thinking of politics. But in 1879, an Englishman called Lord Harris, really pucker, brings out a group of amateurs, and they play a game in Sydney, virtually the cricket ground, and there is an invasion at the pitch when the English do better than all the punters of New South Wales thought. They wanted New South Wales to win. This was the brilliant New South Wales side that had the Bannermans, that had Fred the Demon Spofford. So, and how much is Barton across this? He writes in his diary, he goes to every cricket match under the sun, more so than Robert Menzies. He loves his horse racing. So does George Reid. They go to race, they're members of the AJC, the Australian Jockey Club. So this is a man who is more than the classics, but is not for a moment thinking of politics, because it's really significant with Barton compared to a lot of politicians today, a lot of politicians back then, where they are basically in because of ambition. There is no ambition with Edmund Barton. Barton is someone who loves his sport, loves a drink with the boys, as it were. This is basically the sort of person he is. However, this cricket match with Lord Harris ends in chaos because there are 4 invasions of the pitch, including a 15-year-old called Banjo Patterson, A.B. Patterson, who actually writes about this much later. And one of the umpires down one end is a fellow called Edmund Barton, who is young. He's the umpire. And down the other end is a fellow called George Coulthard, Aussie rules, very significant Aussie rules player from Melbourne, who Harris brings up to Sydney with him. And when the invasion occurs, one of the English cricketers says, "What can you expect from the sons of convicts?" And at that point, Barton writes to the paper and says, no, they should not have done that. And in a matter of 2 months, he's elected into the Legislative Assembly. And George Reid, who's involved with the Cricket Association, says that was terrible of Lord Harris. He got an apology and then he just basically squealed about what had occurred. Reid was against that. 1 year later, Reid's in the Assembly. So both George Reid, Prime Minister number 4, and Edmund Barton, Prime Minister number 1, basically parlay that particular game of cricket into their political careers, which become very successful.
So it seems to me that Barton, who's a barrister really, not, as you said, a political aspirant, that he sort of falls into politics through circumstance rather than through passion. Like it's just a sort of a evolution of his interests and then the reputation, of course, he gets from the Sydney Riot cricket match of 1879. And he wins a seat designated for Sydney University, which is fascinating. I mean, they sort of, in the end, abolished those seats. But, I mean, it is fascinating to think that in the New South Wales Parliament there were seats for people representing the University of Sydney rather than a particular constituency and geographic area.
And on that point, there's Barton, who's very much involved in the cricket, is very much involved in rugby union, who is a rower. In fact, he was a 60-kilogram rower at school. By the time he was actually the Speaker of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, he was about 110 kilograms. So he went up sharply because of lifestyle, but he was going to get in and he did. And you're quite right, it is an oddity, but Barton's ability is such and the respect for him is such that in no time flat he is the Speaker of the Assembly, the youngest in the history of the Assembly, which is not a long history, but a Speaker in the Assembly from 1883 to 1887, and that's important. And a person who's really supporting him is George Reid, his fishing mate from when they were youngsters. They're two they're heavyweights, as it were, both almost literally and figuratively speaking. They are in the Assembly itself. And it's the new brigade, Georgina, taking over, the likes of Barton and company. But Barton's still not, there's no ambition. But there's a critical moment, the first year he was Speaker, a fellow called Lord Rosebery, Minister in the William Gladstone government in Britain, comes to Australia, comes to Sydney, at a ball, delivers a quite significant speech and pretty much says to, I'll say, the native born, what are you doing? This disparate group of colonies needs to get together. And Barton and Rosebery are very close friends for the rest of their lives. And Barton takes this on so that really from 1883 until his moment when he comes out as a federationist in 1889, 6 years later, that's the period when Barton is beginning to get not just interested, but actually in some ways preoccupied by the federation instinct, the federation notion. And that's the key.
And it's interesting, his time as Speaker, he develops a reputation for fairness, doesn't he? The Bulletin, which of course was a very influential magazine of the era, and it really exists till the 1990s, doesn't it? It observes that these youthful Australian parliamentarians, or colonial parliamentarians as they were then, like George Reid and Edmund Barton, it was the triumph of young Australia. But it's also interesting that during this time too, the Bulletin coins the nickname for Edmund Barton, Toby Tosspot, which, to read in 2025 seems pretty derogatory. Maybe it was very derogatory back then.
well, it most definitely it was. The Bulletin and John Norton, the infamous John Norton, who had the brutal tabloid called The Truth, which picked on everyone, he was a drunk and he was appalling and extremely mischievous. Well, both the Bulletin, it must be said, and John Norton go after him. He's a kind of target. But keep this in mind, the Athenaeum Club, which of course you have in Melbourne, indeed, I think you still got the building in Melbourne. The Athenaeum Club in Sydney was a haunt of Barton. So not only did he put on weight quite quickly, but he's very clubbable, he's very companionable, he fits in like a glove, so that's going to work. At the same time, he's actually putting on too much weight. So that led to that, and he's also, to some extent, a man about town. Now, he married Jeannie, and that's a story that we may or may not have time to get onto, but she's very significant in the background, I'll say, as well. He married her, having met her on an IV, InterVarsity cricket match at Newcastle. She was a Newcastle girl. That was in about 1870, and they married in 1877. But she was very important in this. But by the same token, Barton liked his clubbable friends. So the Athenaeum Club was where he basically spent a lot of evenings, it must be said. And indeed so much so that even though he's making a reasonable wage, he wasn't particularly good at sort of the finances. Fortunately, Jeannie was pretty reasonable there. But the 80s was the important period where he'd been inspired but still lacking a particular direction. And it is the case that firms up towards the end of the 1880s in a very significant moment. He goes to the town of Lithgow. Now, I'll just throw into that Joseph Cook, Prime Minister number 6, a North Staffordshire coal miner, goes to the Lithgow coal mines, comes to Australia in 1885, and in the audience, in Barton's audience, is Joe Cook, the miner. So he's going to actually emerge. But Barton gives the most important speech on federation, first speech that he made. And maybe I could just read a tiny bit. Jordan, have we got time for it? One little bit and it gives you a clear sense of where he's coming from. He says, and I quote at one point in the speech, "Great is the question of protection and free trade." The economic argument, is it going to be tariffs or not? And that's very topical at the moment, protection and free trade. He says, "There is no question in the field of Australian politics which is so great and important as the question of the Federation of Australia." Of course, he gets massive cheers. "We must rise above all selfish and party considerations," and that's a theme throughout his entire political career. But then he says, "and endeavour to bring about an Australian Union. Do not let any question interfere with the question of federation." Keep in mind, this is 1889. "This I promise, that whatever I do in regard to this question, I will not be actuated by any idea of the advancement of any person or body of persons or party, but I will look solely to the best means of helping to secure, not merely for New South Wales, but for Australia, the dependency that awaits."
It's very interesting to hear that quote, David, because it really indicates that Barton is not a partisan man. He's not a partisan politician. So, he does side with the protectionists, and which, of course, then puts his relationship with George Reid, who's an ardent free trader, under strain, which is, I guess, a shame because they'd been such close friends from such an early age. But his laser-like focus is on getting federation done. And overlaid on that, of course, is also his lack of sort of real personal ambition as well, isn't there?
Completely true. The interesting thing is, Justice Deakin, of course, famously in the book that came out in 1944, after he died, The Federal Story, actually says that federation came about by a series of miracles, basically. And in lots of ways, that's true. And that affects Barton, because Barton gets offered from George Dibbs, a protectionist Premier of New South Wales, a so-called Republican who really isn't. He's just the ambitious politician. But he says to Barton, "I want you to be a minister in my protectionist government in the early 1890s. Barton faithfully says yes, and that leads to real trouble, because at that point, 1892, 1893, and that follows the National Australasian Convention of 1891, when it looked like federation was going to be done in the next few years. That's, in fact, where Edmund Barton meets Sir John Downer, and they become great friends for the rest of their lives at that, and that's where Barton dazzles, but then he accepts the job in the New South Wales Parliament, the so-called bear pit, as it was called, and it really is, and that starts to undo him. And, in fact, he says himself that the year 1893 is his annus horribilis, and in lots of ways it was. He had to be acting premier. He sent police to Broken Hill to break up a strike. That got him terrible publicity. So much so, and you mentioned the Bulletin, Georgina, that a fellow in the Bulletin was a guy called William Astley, who wrote one of the great books about convict literature, fiction, Tales of the Convict System. He wrote under Price Warong. Well, he was an extraordinary writer, and he was also a real idealist. And when Barton started to fail, that's when Price Warong went for him in the Bulletin and trying to actually get him to sharpen up. And he says, for example, "You were then glowing with enthusiasm in 1891, only a couple of years earlier, and possessed of an exaltation of mind at being among the nation makers. And then he says, and look what's happened. And he says a bit further, look you at Parkes, Henry Parkes, look you at Griffith. Would you today change your comparatively spotless name for their position with their fame? Parkes long ago sold himself to imperialism. Griffin has of late sold himself to caste and privilege. These are among the Iscariots of history. Before it is too late, he says, take warning. Now, that shakes Barton up, as it would. And in fact, at this stage, and indeed for the next 3 years, he's not in the parliament at all. He actually fails to get a seat in the very 1890s. But what he does do, and we said about him being a lawyer, is that during those years, somehow, honestly, miraculously, he's got no dough, he's got a bunch of kids, he has to move out to Manly, which is not a bad gig. He goes across the harbour simply because it's cheaper over there. He's in trouble. And yet he produces approximately 300 speeches, 300 in 3 years for Federation. And what that does is lock him into the people of New South Wales.
So he travels around New South Wales, doesn't he, delivering these speeches, and gets this great reputation during this period when he's not in the bear pit, so to speak, in the colonial parliament from 1894 to 1897. And he gives this, really famous speech. I think it's in 1896 at the Second People's Conference held in Bathurst. He delivers this address, and he really gives this very evocative vision of a new nation of Australia. And he says, I hope that I am at any rate acting in the spirit in which we all labour together, and that the result of our labour will be to found a state of high and august aims, working by the eternal principles of justice and not to the music of bullets, and affording an example of freedom, political morality and just action to the individual, the state and the nation, which will one day be the envy of the world. I think they're very powerful words. And, again, you think, why do we not repeat those words to this day, to be proud of the nation that people like Barton and others were able to create? And also in contrast to the way that different nations around that time were being created in sort of blood and turmoil.
I could not agree more. And the good news on this is that the impact of his performance in 1891 amongst the lawyers and the politicians, his impact going round New South Wales extraordinarily in the middle 1890s to the people and delivering just such speeches, the miners of Lithgow, et cetera, and then, in fact, going to Bathurst. And incidentally, the very Price Warong who got stuck into in 1892 is the secretary in charge of that convention. But Barton has to manage him because he's worried he'll get carried away, and that'll affect the convention meetings, Georgina, that are coming up. The first one in Adelaide in 1897. Barton has to manage Bathurst but deliver the right kinds of words, which he does magnificently. And then, of course, and it's perhaps the segue that he does go to Adelaide for the convention meetings of 1897-98, Adelaide followed by Sydney, followed by Melbourne. But when he goes to Adelaide, not only is he amongst friends, because the South Australians of the 1890s, their delegation was seen by just about everyone as the best delegation. And they really thought the world of Barton. They were suspicious of Reid, and for, in some ways, good reason, but they loved him. And that included Sir John Downer. So that when, in fact, Barton goes to Adelaide, I'm pretty sure he might have even stayed with your great-grandfather when he was there, but his impact was pronounced. And they got right behind him, and that was important, because if they were the smartest delegation, and they were, there you've got New South Wales and Victoria who are going to produce the first Prime Minister. But to have the South Australians, thinking the world of you was going to be important. But he does deliver, the speech in Bathurst, the People's Convention, is really important. And then he goes to the 3 convention meetings where basically he works his backside off, and that's recognised by all his peers.
When Henry Parkes dies in 1896, this really, doesn't it, it leaves Edmund Barton as the leader of the Australian Federation movement, doesn't it? I mean, he gives this, I think at a gathering in Ashfield, he gives this speech and he triumphantly asserts that for the first time in history we have a nation for a continent and a continent for a nation. It's a wonderful quote. I mean, he's considered a father, or at least one of the fathers of Federation, but was there a sense that he was selling out New South Wales in the process? I mean, New South Wales is the leading colony. It was the first colony. It's the richest, most powerful. I mean, he ends up the first Prime Minister, so he does well in that respect. But in terms of states' rights and the interaction of the whole federal system, was there a sense that he was giving too much to the smaller states?
At that point, I'd say definitely not. The person who has a checkered period through these years is George Reid, the so-called yes-no Reid, because even though he was in favour of federation, he actually questioned the first draft of the Constitution that, and the New South Wales, basically more or less voted it down. I won't complicate matters. And that's significant. But in Barton's case, he is in fact flying above it, I'll say. He is never associated with that. Reid is, and even in fact when Reid finally does the deal to get New South Wales having the capital, that's a whole other story, and he gets that deal done so that New South Wales, they have a second referendum and that one gets up, and New South Wales votes pretty heavily in favour of federation. But with Barton, he's standing back from that, and incidentally is still struggling in terms of the immediate politics. But again, that too is another story. But entirely he is focused on the federation ideal so that he doesn't get tainted with that at all. And as we know, that's going to come very much into play in the last days of 1900 when they're looking for a Prime Minister. But his reputation is unsullied, both amongst his peers and also amongst the people of New South Wales. And we know that, for example, Georgina, when they are actually for their 10 delegates to the convention meetings, Barton is, and he's out of politics, and he's numero uno, he gets 15,000 more votes than the very popular George Reid as the number one delegate. That's, the people of New South Wales never lost sight of that for a second, that this was the man that's, producing the fine words, and he was, who is working his backside off, even though he's seen as Toby Tosspot, a sluggard and all the things that the Bulletin and the Truth were always running at him. But the people were not in any way caught up in that. So that there you have Barton, not quite dominating because there were so many important people at those convention meetings, but he was very, very significant. And then ultimately, of course, and there he is again, your great-grandfather, and Barton's great mate from Sydney Grammar, Georgina, Richard O'Connor, who was going to be one of the first High Court judges with Barton. But Dick O'Connor and Sir John Downer and Edmund Barton do all the heavy lifting on the Constitution in 1897 and 1898. Now, it is a conservative constitution, and a reasonable amount of Andrew Inglis Clark's, not just Democratic, but Republican elements get pulled out. But as much as anything, one suspects that's because of compromise. Australians have always done compromise well when they've done compromise, and that includes the politicians. And Barton was aware of that. Barton was actually saying, as Andrew Fisher would later, look, the art of compromise is crucial here. And all the significant people, all the smartest people at those convention meetings knew that he was the key figure. Whenever there was trouble at the convention meetings, he'd go and have a meeting with so-and-so, he'd sit down, work things out, come out of the meeting. He could smooth egos, all for the purpose of getting federation up, and he was renowned for that.
How concerned was he about the level of, I guess, public disengagement with the whole process? Because that's been a critique of federation, and William Coleman's written a really important book about that people weren't really that interested. General, everyday people weren't that interested. It was sort of seen as a bit of an elite project, disconnected from the everyday concerns of people in the Australian community in the colonies.
That's absolutely, Sir John Robertson famously in about 1892-3 said that federation was as dead as Julius Caesar. And in fact, that was a battle for the coming years. Interestingly enough, as important as anything, first of all, Australia was doing well at cricket. The colonial teams were beating the Poms. And they were playing as Australia before we were a nation. So that was important. I know that sounds strange, but it's true that there was so much cricketing success there. This was a big bit. Victor Trumper comes into the frame at this point, and that sort of mobilises things. But more important than anything, to pick your point up, for me, is the fact that they were, and you know that, you're reading about it when you're reading newspapers at the time, going into a new century. You know, it seemed, can we say this, appropriate. Now, people, Barton and a number of others were doing the heavy lifting, because that's the thing that's not given credit. I think you make a great point, and you did at the outset, that why don't we know about this? Well, it's because it was peaceful. We didn't have a civil war. Because in lots of ways, I'm tempted to say it was very Australian. That is to say, there had to be some significant compromise worked through. Imagine getting those delegations from the various states, and particularly New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. These were heavy hitters. And, they're going to be protecting rights, as George Reid did for New South Wales. But there had to be the national story, and that's what, more than anyone else, the South Australian delegates recognised from Barton, and they knew it throughout the convention meetings. That's what Barton was so good at. And in terms of the work that they were putting in, I had a quote maybe just quickly, and that is when the three of them were doing the last constitution draft to be voted on. There's a lovely Robert Garran, the public servant extraordinaire of the time, working on all the sort of legislation, etc., says, and I quote, "Never shall I forget those days and nights in a sitting room at the Grand Hotel, which is now the Windsor Hotel in Melbourne. Barton, O'Connor, Downer and I, Garran, worked on while the city slept. At about midnight, Downer would get up and say, 'Time to go for a walk,' and disappear in the direction of his bedroom. An hour or so later, O'Connor would say bluntly that he was going to bed. Then Barton and I, Garran, would carry on till 4 or 5 in the morning until I could persuade him to call it a day." That's the man that emerged. And I've got another couple of things from Josiah Simon, a couple of those South Australians who recognised just the same. When it was on, he had some sort of superhuman power late in the 1890s. And, when you said about the population, I think the fact that there was a driving force to get there was going to be referenda, and if a referendum got up, we go to federation, which is what the Republic might have done in the late 1990s. But nevertheless, that's what they did. And then when you throw in the new century coming up and the excitement of it, then you see that there's going to be a momentum which ultimately is unstoppable.
How does he end up becoming our first Prime Minister, David? Because, that's a coup for such an unambitious, politically and personally unambitious person. He was obviously ambitious for federation, but beyond that, it doesn't seem like he had his eye on the prize of being the first Prime Minister.
He did. He 100% did not have his eyes on the prize. He was very much an accidental Prime Minister, and it must be said that's why his Prime Ministership, and we'll get to that shortly, but why his Prime Ministership for him was a struggle, and it was a struggle. It's because it was in the achievement of federation, and the people did recognise that. That's the importance of it, that, the closer we get. But you said, how did he become Prime Minister? Well, as we know, there's a bit of a story there, which runs that the first Governor-General, a fellow called Lord Hopetoun, is appointed late, but he comes out in early December 1900, and it's his task, on the back of his advice, to actually say, well, you're going to be Prime Minister. We need a Prime Minister for the event on the 1st of January 1901. We haven't done an election yet, but we need a Prime Minister. And Hopetoun spends almost 3 weeks getting wooed by a sort of, what does one say, a bit of a rascal, Sir William Lyon, whose seat is down near Albury in the Murray River, who's not a federationist. He got in by accident himself. He got in with Labor support. That's a whole other story. But in fact, Hopetoun, in the famous, I suppose amongst people like myself and yourself, made the Hopetoun blunder. That is to say, he said, well, William Lyon, I want you to be Prime Minister. Horror, shock and horror. How much so? Between the 19th of December and Christmas Eve, 10 p.m, 1900, everything occurs. Now, Deacon's really live. Barton's not going to do anything. Deakin says, the only person who can be Prime Minister is Edmund Barton. All the people know it. All the politicians know it. Get your act together.
Because it was thought that Lyon was just, he was not committed to the to federation.
He'd never been committed to federation.
So, why give the prize of first Prime Minister of this new federation to someone who wasn't in the trenches, basically, wasn't drafting it till 4 a.m.
Not at all. And that, would have been a disaster. Instead, Joseph Chamberlain, the hugely significant colonial secretary in London, he telegrammed Houghton and said, "Are you kidding me?" Because they all knew what Barton had done, because they'd already, basically they'd been in London in 1900. That is to say, Deakin and Barton and Kingston. Incidentally, Barton in London, when they were trying to get it basically as an act of the British Parliament, the Constitution, Barton is said to have delivered in 4 months 400 speeches. 400 speeches. Try that on.
That's sort of 4 a day-ish.
Exactly. Many of them would be in London, but he was also the best worker with the likes of Lord Rosebery. Barton was the conciliator, was the diplomatic operator. Deakin not so much, you know what I mean, and Kingston by no means so much. But Barton once again came to the fore. So that's why Chamberlain says, you better get that right, Lord Houghton. So, in fact, they make that decision on Christmas Eve that Barton would be the Prime Minister. In some ways, it's not accidental that occurs, but in accepting that, and we're never going to know exactly what he thought. It was not just right and proper, it was the decision of the Australian population and of his peers. And maybe I think if this is worth doing, can I say that how important was Barton to the population of Australia? I'll read just a little bit from my monograph, which actually intros with Patrick McMahon Glynn, a South Australian, another one of those great South Australians, put it well when he observed a few years into Federation that Sir Edmund Barton was one of those men who happily seemed to be created for great occasions. And then I write, a generation of new Australian mums and dads agreed with him. Across the length and breadth of the vast continent, they chose to honour Barton in the naming of their children. From Birregurra to Boonar, Coongulmarang to Karkor, Parkes to Pindar, Wagga to Werribee, Kalgoorlie to Kapunda, and Broken Hill to Bega, Edmund and Barton, we know this is a certainty, were inked with pride onto the birth certificates of the newborn Australians.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
That was the one.
Yeah.
That was, and it just showed you the sort of popularity of him at that point. But then, of course, the Prime Ministership starts. And he's never comfortable. He's actually never comfortable. He's got no less than 5 former premiers in his cabinet. That's going to be tough.
He's appointed as I guess it's a caretaker government, isn't it, by Lord Houghton to be the first Prime Minister, sworn in, of course, on the first day of the Federation, on the 1st of January 1901. And then his first job really is to organise the general election, isn't it? The 29th and 30th of March 1901. And, his ministry, as you say, it's a pretty heavy-hitting ministry. It wasn't people necessarily, I think, that he would have chosen himself. It was representative, wasn't it, of all the key players? Very
much so. Exactly that. The so-called Cabinet of Kings, but they were extremely difficult to work with. And almost from the get-go, they say that his protection, Liberal protectionists win the election, as was expected. And then basically you've got a number of things going on for Barton. The first thing is he has to go down to Melbourne. Now, this is a guy that's been brought up in Sydney Harbour and lived in Manly. Well, he's not going to take kindly to Melbourne. As they say in the Parliament building, he's got a little attic where his cabinet meets, and it's cold. The building was notoriously cold in 1901, so he's got that problem. He's got contending people from the different states, all of whom are smart as, who are bickering, and he's got to try and sort that out. And then he's got to come up with policy. So White Australia, we know that was a standard. That was always going to be the case instantly. Votes for women, tariffs to be introduced, but more than anything, what Barton's achievement in his years as Prime Minister, from essentially March, I guess January to September 1903, and this was his skill, is to put down the apparatus of a nation. Incredible. This comes back to your earlier comments, Georgina, about why don't they get credit? The credit should be given for how cleverly that was done. We mightn't agree with every policy these days, and certainly not White Australia, But it was such a, the way that they went about it, the smoothness of those early years. Yes, there was plenty of bickering in the Parliament, but, you've got a new party, more or less, the Labor Party emerging. You've got Reid with his free traders. So you've got very contentious issues raised in the Parliament, but they are putting down the infrastructure of the nation. And they do that very successfully indeed. So successfully that when we have the second Deakin Prime Ministership from 1905 to 8 and the second Andrew Fisher Labor Prime Ministership from 1910 to 1913, we are regarded in Australia as the social laboratory of the world. The world was coming to us. The Americans were coming to us. The Europeans were coming to us. We had the most progressive social welfare legislation in the world, and the world was coming to us. Now, that's in no small part due to Barton. At this point, of course, he's moved to the High Court, as we know, in 1903. It's the succour of the High Court. The tranquility, which suited his personality down to the ground. And it also got him out of politics. That was the thing.
Well, his job had kind of been done. As you say, he had an ambitious program of legislation in that first parliament, including the old age pension, transcontinental railway, the establishment of the High Court, establishment of the Commonwealth Public Service, and of course Garran is key there, and universal suffrage. His job kind of was done though to bring about federation. So do you think that's why he voluntarily stood down as Prime Minister in 1903? He just thought, well, I've set this up now. I can go on to this High Court that we've created and see out my days there.
In partly a big why, yes, a big yes. As well as that, he had a term where he collapsed in later 1902, which was an issue. Interestingly, when he went to England for the coronation of Edward VII, and he was feted over in England, going back to England as the Prime Minister, they loved him to death. So he had that. But on the way, he and Sir John Forrest from WA and their wives and partners went to Venice and then Rome. And Barton, how about this? I put it on. It was just a lovely touch, not from me, but basically from Barton. He goes to Rome and gets an audience with Pope Leo XIII, very important pope, in fact, and just chats away in Latin. Just chats to the Pope in Latin. He gets a medal from the Pope. They hit it off wonderfully well, except that because he's gone to talk to the Catholic head of the church worldwide, the Protestants of Sydney put a petition together, 30,000 signatures, abhorring what he's done over there. And in some ways, almost psychologically, that did Barton in. We know that, the way he wrote about it, just, what the hell. I've done all of this, and you get that sort of crap from a set number of people, and that too is a bit of a story. But that, everything added up to him. And then, of course, Georgina, was the interesting thing with the High Court going to get organised in 1903. Everyone thinks, Barton wants the Chief Justice's job. There's Barton again, who says, no, the finest jurist in this nation is Samuel Griffiths from Queensland. He must be Chief Justice, and so he is. And, of course, the other two High Court judges are Dick O'Connor, the fishing mate and the cricketing mate of Barton at Sydney Grammar, and Barton himself. They are, you mentioned it earlier, they are, in terms of states' rights, all three interpret the spirit of the Constitution as being one that must protect states' rights. And they're conscious of what has occurred in America. But that's when it starts to get a little bit trickier but interesting in the High Court, because once there are two new judges, they being Isaac Isaacs, the first Australian Governor-General in the 1930s, Australian-born, and who else do they point? Henry Bourne-Higgins of Harvester Judgment fame. The notion of federation should gazump state rights. So then it's on for young and old in the High Court for the forthcoming years, but still in the spirit of it. It's interesting that the three High Court judges for a few years until 1906 used to have lunch every day. They met every day. They would go to lunch together. Once they got the two new justices, that all that all stopped.
Oh, it's very interesting, and we can only speculate what he would think of the interpretation of the Constitution 124 years later, where state rights are very much degraded compared to those early years of federation. David, what a wonderful story you brought to us, the story of Edmund Barton, such an important figure in the formation of our nation, and someone who we would all do very well to remember more. So thank you.
My pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.